This is a panel about policy, not politics, but policy does not operate in a vacuum. It operates within political constraints, and some of those were alluded to earlier today. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes at the beginning of the panel to talk a little bit about the constraints in which we operate. And so I guess I'll ask the entry question this way. Why is deficit reduction so hard? Why is fiscal reform so hard to do? And I'll start with Wendy.
We basically have two ways of financing our spending priorities. We can finance our spending through taxes, and if we do it through well-designed taxes, then that limits the negative effect on GDP from what are probably inevitably reductions in incentives from higher taxes. Or we can finance our spending priorities through borrowing, which makes our economy smaller. And the salience of who gets hurt and benefits from those two different ways of financing spending, the salience is really different. So if you raise taxes on people, they're probably going to understand to the penny how their taxes were affected. Or at least they're going to be able to read about that in the newspaper if they want. And there will be tables that show the distributional effects. And we can argue about whether or not those correctly reflect incidence and such. But these will be conversations that are out there in the open and relatively easy for people to discuss. When you think about the negative effects on economic output from financing spending through borrowing, those effects are slow, and it's very difficult to figure out who bears the negative economic effects. And so I think it's no surprise to me that we have chosen to finance our spending through borrowing. Just because someone's given me the floor for a minute, I will say I think when you look at CBO's projections of how financing our spending through borrowing does indeed crowd out economic output, those effects are estimated to be, because we have a very large capital stock, and we borrow a fair bit from abroad, which limits the negative effects on the capital stock, though it has its own GNP versus GDP effects. The effects are modest. They're negative. I am very confident that financing our spending through well-designed tax policy creates a bigger economy over time than financing our spending through borrowing. But financing our spending through borrowing, the effects are the negative effects are modest, and they're slow, and we're a big economy, and I do not at all, I don't want to, if anybody would like to come up to me afterwards, I have strong opinions about where we will and won't see major disruptions and how markets are responding to that slow, grinding negative effect. Fine, I will now come back to the actual question at hand. I think the reason it's hard is because one way of feeling the pain of paying for our spending priorities is really salient, and the other way is really opaque. And we don't really have a national conversation that says these are our spending priorities. This is our consensus for what our spending priorities are, even though I think that there's very significant revealed preference as to what our spending priorities are. We don't really have a conversation in this country of saying, this is clearly what we have revealed ourselves to want to spend money on. Let's now figure out how to pay for it.
Alex, Bill, either of you, any thoughts on that?
I'm going to give you 6 reasons why it's a hard problem. Okay, first of all,
I hope somebody's taking notes.
Founding fathers made it difficult to make big changes, deliberately. That's a feature, not a bug of our system most of the time. It's a bug when you need the government to do something. It's a feature when you want the government out of the way and let the private sector go on. But you have to get the House, the Senate, the White House, et cetera. This is not a parliamentary system. Reason 2 is the classic Mansur-Olson concentrated costs, diffuse benefits. You raise taxes on somebody, you cut their spending. They're very aware of that. The benefits accrue to future generations. They may not even be alive right now. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut down to 5, not 6. The third problem is there's no deadline. We talked earlier today about how nobody quite knows where D star is. They're not going to act until they have to on something like this. The fourth problem is that even if they could agree on a compromise, they need to have a way to be sure that the compromise gets implemented. Nobody wants to be the sucker left holding the bag and all the cuts they didn't want happen and all the cuts the other side did want to happen. So there needs to be some guarantee, some way of assuring that the cuts actually happen. And the last reason is the public. The public is so conflicted about this that it provides no support for any politician to stick their neck out. If you ask people, do you want tax increases? They say no. If you ask people, do you want spending cuts? They say no. If you ask them, are you okay with big deficits and debt? They say no. So what's a politician supposed to do with that background?
I don't know. I wonder what the sixth one is. It should be the one that I answer now. But I would just say, I just pick up on the point.
We have Q&A for that, by the way.
I would just pick up on the last point about the public. I mean, there's a myopic nature of the legislative process, which encourages politicians to think very intensely about those voters. And again, that's maybe a feature, not a bug in many respects, as you noted earlier. But there is something that is not cool, not trendy, not popular about addressing these issues that make it not a priority for elected officials' constituents.
Right. Okay. So, with the political and public choice challenges in mind, we're going to shift a little bit to the policy discussion, the main purpose of this panel. And as that part of that transition, I'm going to read off my phone my favorite Milton Friedman quote, because I can't memorize it no matter how hard I try. Milton Friedman once said, and I think this is in Capitalism and Freedom, somebody at AEI can probably check that for me, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And so I think that is the task of the panel here is not to make the politically difficult political reality, but to keep ideas alive and available until the political moment arises. And so in that spirit, let's start at the highest conceptual level and kind of work our way down to details. First, let's start with what is the right conceptual framework for constructing a sustainable federal budget, both on the spending side and on the revenue side, how those should be constructed, the relationship of spending to revenues, the relationship of those two things to other metrics, whether it's size of the economy or whatever metrics you prefer. Let's start there, because I actually think there are, before you get into specific policy disagreements, like I like this tax, no, I don't like that tax, there may not actually be consensus on the right basic framework to use. Wendy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, first, I find it remarkable that I'm going to say I think that was a great quote. But because I think, and I think it does come back to what Bill was saying, why this is so hard, and your point about how there really isn't a lot of, it's not sexy. If market perception changes, and because of politics, because of a disruption in financial markets, because there's a failed auction, if market perception changes radically about what's happening with debt and deficits, it will become sexy to think about how to raise taxes and reduce spending to satisfy markets and get interest rates down and bring stability back. And I think it's absolutely right that it's conversations like this one that make sure there's lots of well thought out ideas on the shelf to take off the shelf in that moment. I think part of the challenge is that the likelihood of us acting well in advance of that moment seem really low, but nonetheless, I absolutely agree with the premise that we should be making those decisions now. And my own thinking is that if you were to get a whole bunch of tax experts, tax technocrats together, and say, this is how much we want to raise in revenues. This is what we roughly think the distributional composition of those tax revenue increases should be. That the tax technocrats wouldn't entirely agree, but they'd agree a lot. And I think the question about how much we should raise in revenues and what the distributional table should look like are largely political questions. And certainly the distributional one is. And then the first one of how much we should raise in revenues, the reason that's a political question is because, again, comes back to, well, how big do we want the federal government to be? So what we need to decide, I think the conceptual framework is, how big do we want the federal government to be? And unless you're going to talk about dumb numbers that we just don't have the tax base to support, I'm going to just assume that away. If we're in the ballpark of 18% of GDP, 20% of GDP, 22% of GDP, we clearly have the tax base in this country to support that size of a federal government. So what we need to decide is how big of a federal government we want, and then now decide how we want to finance it. I appreciate that there's going to then be some interaction, some iterative nature in all of that when people say, wait, I'm sorry, that means the taxes are what? Okay, so fine. But that's around the edges. We're a really rich country, and we just need to decide, do we want the federal government to be spending this money, or do we want the private sector to be spending this money? What do we want where do we want the spending to happen? So I think it goes in that order. How big of a federal government? Okay, let's figure out how we're going to finance it and have the politicians tell us what the distributional table should be.
Alex, thoughts on that?
So in both of your comments, Wendy, you made references to like well-designed tax policy relative to debts and deficits, and I think that alone is is an important topic. What is well-defined tax policy? There's also a question, and maybe the technocrats could agree, but there's also a question about whether or not that's a realistic alternative to debt and deficit, or is just tax increases the alternative? So what I'm saying is there's a question about we don't have a perfect tax code today. We all agree with it. I think we would all agree it's not perfect. We might disagree about why it's not perfect, but it's not perfect. If we wanted to get more revenue out of the system, are we going to make it more perfect or less imperfect? We're going to try to improve the efficiency of the tax code while raising more revenues. How would we do that? We would, maybe broaden the base. Maybe we would change the distribution of the tax code, or we could raise more revenues in the future than we do currently and make the tax code less efficient, right? I mean, those are their choices, right? And so we have some system today with some inefficiency and some progressivity, and as we move to a system that generates more revenues, if we move to a system that generates more revenues, there is this question about whether, who is making those changes, and whether it's the technocrats that have a way to see this opportunity to say, okay, given the fact that we are agreeing that if it is the fact that we're agreeing we need more revenues, now more than ever we should have a system that's more efficient than the old system, broader base, lower rates, that kind of stuff. Or we could say we need more revenues, and I want the system to be more progressive, right? I don't like the change in the income distribution and the rich aren't paying enough, or this thing or that thing, or these base broadeners are, obviously we'll never get at them, so therefore we should just change the rates. And we could make the system bigger and less efficient. And I think we just need to recognize that that's a choice that politicians will make. And they may not make the right choice. And so as the system gets bigger, it may get less efficient. I'm not saying that what should happen, but I just think that that's a risk that we should acknowledge.
2 quick points. One is when we talk about the right conceptual framework, it's not just how big or small government is, what government actually does. that I think is central to the question. And second, there's got to be, I mean, I think this is obvious, but there's got to be some balancing of costs and benefits. It would be, it would be great to say if the government could do, we think the government could do X. If X turns out to be prohibitively expensive, maybe we don't think the government should do X. But there's got to be some balancing of costs and benefits.
Bill, you mentioned not just how big government is, but what government does. I mean, we could get into conversations about things like people have proposed like capital budgets before, right? Like in investments that increase productivity versus transfers with a leaky bucket or whatever. I mean, is that what you were getting at?
No, I was just getting at, people say government spending should be 20%, in Europe it's 30%, it should be 22%. That's one dimension of the debate, but there's another dimension of what's the government actually spending it on? What are they doing? I think this comes up particularly in the debt debate, where we tend to focus on deficits and debt rather than what the money is being used for. And we would all take a step back and agree there are good uses of debt and bad uses of debt.
Well, even within that framework, right? Even if you say like, oh, healthcare is a good thing, spending on healthcare, but then right, there's a how level.
There's
right?
a how, right.
And it's the same thing. It's the same as it's the outlay side of my tax point, right? Like we can have 18% of GDP revenues or 19 or 20, but how we raise those revenues really matters. And the same thing with the spending. We could spend it wisely or we could spend it poorly.
Yeah, your tax point is key. It's like we're not talking about best systems that exist only on paper. We're talking about systems in the real world.
So I worry that these are, I mean, there are really big issues here, and then there are moderately sized issues here. So the really big issues here is that mandatory spending as a share of GDP has risen a bunch, just in lockstep with changes in demographics, and it's projected to rise a lot. And as we get richer as a society, we seem to want to spend a lot more money on healthcare, and we seem to want to support older people. And so I think that those are the large pressures in the federal budget. And I think we just don't have the tax system put in place right now to support those spending priorities. So I think we can for sure decide around the edges, oh, let's improve the Social Security system. Let's bend the cost curve a little bit. But I think that when you think about what, I wasn't here for full Swiggle this morning, but what I can, I am sure he was talking about, what Kent was talking about, those are the big picture things of we have projected rising deficits because we have big pressures on the federal government given our very, like broad-based spending priorities, and we don't have the tax system in place to finance those. So I don't want us to go immediately to the narrow of, oh wait, I have a way to change the tax expenditures for the employer contribution to, like, I worry that immediately goes to the narrow and ignores the, hey, wait, I think we do want the federal government to, generally speaking, do these things.
Can I just pick up on that point? I think your point about the demographic changes is really, really important when we think about both the spending side and then subsequently what the appropriate revenue side is. And so, he's like, particularly I think it's the case with Social Security, that it's all about demographics. When we think about the Medicare program, I think it's about more than demographics, right? You've got a demographic change and you've got a change in the price, and maybe a change in preferences for healthcare consumption. So the Medicare program is growing faster than the Social Security program because it's more than just demographics. And so I think that the implication for that on the revenue side is that the historical evidence or the historical data on revenues as a share of GDP may not be the best indicator for what the future revenues need to be. But that's different than saying, we just need to jack it up because, demographics is only a piece of the change that we've seen in what's happening in the economy. And this cost benefit or efficiency issue becomes only more and more important. We should think of, as we have a large federal healthcare program, we should think even more about how to make that program efficient rather than we did in the past.
Alex, you just alluded to a question that I wanted to ask when you mentioned taxes as a share of GDP. because there's sort of this, sometimes people say, oh, all the policy experts, the technocrats, I think was the word you might have used, can agree on a lot of stuff, and then there's the political problem, right? Kind of bringing it back, though, do even the policy experts, much less the elected officials, agree on, and this is almost a first principles kind of thing, how to measure whether a deficit reduction package is increasing or decreasing spending or revenues over the long run? This is kind of getting to the question of baselines and what's the proper way to look at these balances, current law, current policy, constant share of GDP. I mean, is there even, and we saw this first with the Bush tax cuts, and we've seen it subsequently. At the risk of sounding pessimistic, isn't there even a disagreement amongst experts on that sort of threshold question?
I think there is. It's not always the case. I mean, it's the case in particular right now because we're in the middle of we're in a place where the current policy revenue baseline and the current law revenue baseline are very different. It's not always the case that they diverge a lot, but because of the nature of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and it's the temporary nature of many of the provisions in that act, there's this large divergence. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there are budget experts that think about this one way, and maybe there's not a huge disagreement among sort of analysts who look at this, but I think among politicians, it's very easily the case, excuse me, that they can diverge quite radically. And so Republicans may be looking at a baseline reflective of their preferred policies and the laws that they enacted, and Democrats may be looking at a baseline, the current law baseline. And so to the extent that those baselines are very different, this becomes big dollars, right? But this baseline issue exists both with respect to revenues in that regard, but it came up earlier in our conversations with respect to Social Security and how CBO thinks about the benefits that are payable versus those that can be financed. And so there are important questions here. They're pretty technical in some respect, but they really do influence our understandings of how big the problem is and therefore how big a policy change is required to address those problems.
But I think this comes back to then what's the right framework for thinking about it. So for sure, when you're proposing a policy, comparing it to a baseline, whatever your baseline is, just has to be part of the political conversation. But in terms of a framework for thinking about the issue and what's consistent with all of the discussion we've heard today, what you really want to do is think about what does this mean for the world of spending for the next 3 decades? What does this mean for the world of revenues for the next 3 decades? And does that world of spending match what my priorities are if you're thinking about whether you individually like what's being put on the table? And do I think the tax revenues do enough to support that spending? So that question will be what it's going to be regardless of what your point of comparison is. Just look at the projections under the world that is being proposed.
Yeah. So, Wendy, if we decided hypothetically that we want the current level of spending, that's what we want, right? And we're gonna
spending under current law. Is that what you mean?
Well, so you're kind of it's kind of a spoiler there in a way. What I was going to get at was the current level of spending. If we raise taxes to match the current level of spending today, will taxes match the current level of spending 30 years from now? And I think the answer is probably not, right? Because there's growth in the spending that revenues generally don't keep up with. And so a decision to pay for, this is the government we want today and we're going to pay for it, won't last forever. And at some period, over time, we actually won't be paying for that level of government anymore.
That's right. I mean, it can't be static because our demographics aren't static. And, surely, the facts on the ground will change and policies should change as the facts on the ground change. Maybe we'll get incredibly more efficient when it comes to healthcare and at the same time not want to gorge ourselves on healthcare. Like that could happen. Maybe geopolitical issues will become less of a big deal, and we can cut back on military spending. It could happen. So maybe AI will make us wildly more productive, and that will create all the tax revenue we need. But I think the policies that we need to put in place now, if we want them to be sustainable, if we want to continue consuming healthcare, and we want to, I'm just now being redundant. Yes, in my world, you need tax revenues rising as a share of GDP.
Okay. Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add, or are
I'm
you?
not even sure what the question is right now.
Okay. Let me ask a question that you'll probably be sure what the question is.
Okay.
Can we all agree, and I'm crossing my fingers on this one because I don't know for sure that I'm going to get the answer I want. Can we all agree that the scary, long-term, unsustainable trajectory the federal budget is on is not at all driven by discretionary spending?
Yes.
Okay. So, in fact, right, the CBO baseline assumes that discretionary spending will shrink as a share of GDP over time. And so if you want to think of it that way, it's actually offsetting even more unsustainability than would otherwise appear. It's ironic, right? Because, and this kind of gets into the political question a little bit. I'm not really trying to go there, but the last few times Congress has tried to do serious deficit reduction, and I'm really going back to 2011 and the Budget Control Act, and then last year with the debt limit deal between former Speaker McCarthy and President Biden, they relied very heavily on discretionary spending caps, even though discretionary spending is shrinking as a share of the economy under the baseline anyway. And I think, kind of, answer the question, that kind of goes to the political and public choice challenges, but that leads to what I think of as the big three, the big 800-pound gorillas in the room: taxes, healthcare, and retirement. We've already had our Social Security panel, so we don't want to step on their jurisdiction, so we're going to take that one off the table. And I think the focus is kind of on taxes and healthcare, and we've already talked a little bit about those things. Healthcare, I am not a health policy expert, but it's interesting that there is a parallel problem between the federal budget and the economy on healthcare, that it's not just that health spending is growing unsustainably as a share of the federal budget, but national health expenditures are growing as a share of GDP, both public and private healthcare expenditures. You can say that's good or bad, but it's certainly, we're higher, much higher than most of the developed world, and we continue to grow as a share of GDP. So seeing that there appears to be some relationship there between the federal budget and the overall economy, does that say anything to us about where we ought to be looking when it comes to health spending?
I understand that question. So let me take a step back for a second. Something like 3/4 of federal spending is military, net interest, Social Security, and health. And the idea that we're going to cut military right now doesn't seem very likely. The idea that we cut net interest is called defaulting. We don't want to do that. Social Security we talked about. So health is the last big part of that puzzle. There are a couple of things. I want to make the same not a health policy expert caveat that you made, but there are a couple of things that stand out to me about healthcare spending. One is the large role of administrative costs in the U.S. system relative to other countries. A second is that a large component of healthcare costs consists of people's income, doctors, nurses, et cetera. And so when we talk about cutting healthcare costs, in some sense, we're making a veiled attempt to cut people's income. And that may indicate why it's so difficult to do it. And the third thing is, as technology advances, procedures that used to cost infinite amounts of money because they were impossible to do, come down in cost, and they cost large finite amounts of money, but then people have those procedures, and so healthcare expenditures go up. So this is a serious comment, as I've gotten older, I have become much more sympathetic to the notion that healthcare expenditures naturally rise with income. So there's a problem there, and I will be the first to confess I don't know how to solve it, but it has a lot of interesting contours to it.
I think the challenge, though, is that they rise faster than income, right?
Right.
Not just with income.
Well, they have risen faster than income for the last 40 or 50 years. Gene Sterling makes this point every year, basically. He looks at the budget and says GDP went up by X and healthcare spending was Y% of that. And it's always a big number. We've just gradually moved towards spending, as we become a richer, older country, we've gradually moved towards spending more on healthcare.
Do you want?
I don't know. I'm not I'm also not a healthcare expert, and yet we'll opine. So
we all slept in a Holiday Inn Express last night, so it's good. It's good.
So you don't want to be spending money on healthcare that's worthlessly spent, right? So we want healthcare spending to be efficient. So anything that we can do to just make our healthcare spending more efficient, we should do. It's money laying on the sidewalk. Fine. Let's just say that we should do that. I have ideas to cut administrative costs, but the Hamilton Project has put out proposals in this regard. But I will just say that that's money on the sidewalk. I think the two other questions are, or maybe three other questions. One, I'm not sure it's absurd, and this is related to the point that Bill was making. I'm not sure that it's absurd that as we get richer, we spend an increasing amount over and above how much richer we got on healthcare. And you can say, oh, but that can't happen forever. And I will say, oh, for Pete's sake. We're not at forever yet. It can happen for a very long time. And as we get richer. So maybe that's just what we've decided we value. Seems kind of reasonable. And then you have to ask the question, okay, how much do we want the federal government to do and how much do we want the private sector to do? And then you can say, okay, if we actually, accepting that there is a distribution of income and people are going to have different access to healthcare depending on what their income is, we can decide, you know what, we want a budget. We want a federal budget where we spend this much on healthcare and no more. And then we need to recognize that we're saying, you, individual person sitting over there, you get this much healthcare and no more. And maybe what we're really saying is, if you had lived your life differently and been luckier and been higher income to have all of the money that you want in the world, then you could have gotten that healthcare, but that's cold comfort to that person. We need to be very clear that we are saying to that person, you get this much healthcare and no more. Now, we do that in all sorts of different respects in terms of federal policy. So I'm not saying that that's at all beyond the pale, but I don't think we even or remotely have the maturity as a country to have that conversation in a transparent way and say, we are going to tell these poor old people that they need to go to hospice. And so that's the hard thing about if we simply want to have a federal government that spends this much on healthcare and no more, then I think that's the hard conversation we're having or have to have.
So a couple of thoughts. First, just on the discretionary point, I know you wanted to get unanimity on that point. It is true that in the baseline, CBO projects that discretionary is going down, but that's sort of by construct, by rule, right? That they are their rules tell them that they have to assume that it's a fixed increases only with inflation, not with growth of GDP. So that the problem that we face may be larger than it appears if discretionary spending grows, off in a manner that's different.
But that's an annual decision by Congress starting from zero, right? If Congress does nothing, discretionary spending is zero. It's only if Congress decides to enact more.
Correct. Right. Through the appropriations process.
Right.
That said, it's not the driver of our problems, right? I mean, it is the things that we're saying are the drivers. It's our entitlement programs that are the drivers. What I'll say about healthcare, I think I think one, Bill, your point about it's wages, it's doctors and nurses' salaries, it's so important to the fact of understanding why we struggled so much. It also, I think, helps explain why there's so much focus on the non-wage part of healthcare reform, right? So it's all about like drug spending, right? Because that's not someone's wage, it's like someone's profits or something like that. Because of the difficulty in saying, no, doctors aren't going to get another 5% boost or whatever it is. And that's where a huge percentage of the money is. And so that problem, I think, is a big part of the problem. But I'd just also say that two things can be true. It can be the case that we as we age and our demographics shift, and as we become wealthier and our preferences shift towards more healthcare, that is true, that is happening. It's also the case that the incentives in the program might also be contributing to the growth of the program, right? And so, it's going to be pretty hard to undo the demographics, at least with federal policy. So we're going to have to deal with that, right? We're going to have more old people in the future than we had in the past. But we do need to think, to what extent are there ways to change the incentives in the program so that lawmakers don't, just simply keep voting to give raises to doctors and nurses all the time because that feels good to them. And to the extent that we can slow the growth of the program through those types of mechanisms, we can mitigate some of the trend that we have in the baseline.
So, all right, let me shift gears here. I think now that we've all proven our healthcare expertise, I was going to say taxes, but I want to take a little bit of a broader look. I think for all of our careers until a few years ago, the words taxes and revenues were pretty much synonymous. 98% or something, 99% of federal revenues came from taxes. However, we've now in recent years learned about these things called tariffs. And, we always knew about tariffs, but in the past, tariffs were trade policy, they were economic policy, they were national security policy and foreign policy, but they weren't budget policy, they weren't fiscal policy. They were too small and immaterial to really be part of those conversations. And we've had a little bit of talk about well-designed tax policy, and we could do a whole panel on that because there's a great deal of tax expertise up here. But I don't want to miss, looking at the clock, I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about this other kind of revenue that is now increasingly becoming a material component of the federal budget. Our last two presidents are the two most, in my view, the two most pro-tariff presidents since Herbert Hoover. From FDR to Obama, we had a bipartisan White House level consensus on free trade, and that is changing. And of course, Trump is more pro-tariff than Biden by a long shot, but I think Biden's a clear number two since, going back to FDR, who was a free trader. And now we're talking about hundreds of billions in tariffs that are already in place in the over 10 years. We're raising hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs. I know that certain people in the Trump inner circle always saw it in the context of the TCJA and then the tariffs that came shortly after that. They see it now in the context of the campaign talk about continuing to cut taxes, but imposing a general 10% tariff and maybe other even higher tariffs on some countries, like 60% on China. Even though the news stories don't tend to talk about those two things in the same articles, you get articles that say Trump said he's going to cut taxes, and you get articles that say Trump said he's going to raise tariffs. There are people in his circle who see the two tied together as a swap. And from a public finance perspective, they want the federal government to rely more heavily on external tariffs and less heavily on internal taxes. Obviously, I think the Biden folks don't go nearly as far, but they've left very substantial levels of tariffs in place. Do we need to start thinking about tariffs as a fiscal option, as a deficit reduction option going forward, as a subset of taxes even?
No, we don't. But others clearly are. And I think it's unfortunately a timely question and a relevant question. Sort of orders of magnitude. The levels of tariffs that former President Trump is talking about relative to the expiration of the TCJA. We're getting into territories of like we could pay for TCJA extension with former President Trump's tariff agenda. Maybe not quite, but it's that order.
Same order of magnitude, right?
Yeah. And we're talking about trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions of dollars in the past, but trillions of dollars going forward over the budget window and potential tariffs. Tariffs are bad. And I appreciate your point about President Biden coming in second, but President Biden has sort of a status quo strategy with respect to tariffs, which is a very distinct strategy and not nearly as destructive as the proposals that are coming out of the Trump campaign.
So I am the one who has said a couple of times a well-designed tax system. This is not a well-designed. I mean, putting a 10% tariff on everything coming into the country is not a well-designed tax system. And I don't actually quite understand the scores that I've seen because I can't. It's hard for me to contemplate an economy that withstands those tariffs.
I don't think those scores tend to incorporate a lot of behavioral response.
You're a dynamic scorer person.
I am a dynamic scorer person in many regards, and specifically like this one. If we're going to talk about this amount of tax revenue on this narrow of a tax base, I don't get it. Like I don't see it. But it's funny. You were talking about how this feels like a bygone era. Yeah, like tariffs are so old timey. Like this idea that we're gonna raise tax revenue through tariffs because economic activity is really opaque. It's the only way we can really know how much economic activity there is to go to the ports and see what we can see with our eyes, see the stuff that's coming off the ship onto the port. Like there's a reason that tariffs played a significant role in our economy a very long time ago. We now have a much more efficient way to raise revenue. And so I think rather than seeing tariffs as a way to solve our fiscal issues, I think it's more being suggested. I mean, that the arguments that I think I can at least grapple with are tariffs as industrial policy. And there, it's still not like I believe that one of the things that the tax system does and spending system does, like I believe that one of the things fiscal policy does is influence the composition of output in the U.S. economy and basically has an industrial policy aspect to it. I think that's always been true. I think it's true now, and we need to just be clever about how we do it. I think tariffs as industrial policy it's really narrowly targeted.
I was going to say, to do tariffs, even have a chance of doing it fairly effectively as industrial policy, you have to target it and not have a general tariff.
It's super narrow. You probably want to I can see reasons. I can see the way some countries have implemented tariffs as part of industrial policy in a way that has had long-term gains. But like
our anti-dumping rules.
Like what?
Like anti-dumping.
Yeah, or hey, we really need to coddle this one industry and we're going to do it through tariffs for a time until it grows and gets more mature, and then but we are if this were the one thing that was keeping us from the frontier of really perfect tax policy and industrial policy, I'd be all on board with having this conversation, but we are not. This is not the low-hanging fruit.
So, Bill, did you want to say something?
So as tax policy, tariffs are a terrible idea. They're usually brought on for tax purposes to try to manipulate the trade balance, but the trade balance, they don't have that effect. The trade balance is going to depend on the difference between domestic saving and domestic investment, and if the tariffs don't change that, it's not going to change the trade balance. You can use the simplest macroeconomic identity equations to show that. In terms of their incidence, One of the apparent attractions of tariffs is that they tax people elsewhere. They tax foreigners, but they don't actually do that. They raise costs for American consumers. They raise costs for American businesses, and they appeal maybe strategic or national security or industrial policy, but there's no tax policy argument for it.
So let's then shift into more of a comfort zone and well-designed tax policy. Let's just go down the line. We'll start with Bill, go towards me. Would love to hear your thoughts on some ideas, some options that you consider to be, and we'll see how much consensus we have, well-designed tax policy options. And if you want to throw in some well-designed non-tax policy options that you are a particular fan of, please feel free to do so as well.
All right, so the first option has to be getting the IRS the money to enforce the tax system. And that is going to actually make money by funding the IRS at the level it needs. After that, you can go in various directions. Personally, I would favor a carbon tax over the various subsidies we have for clean energy, both on revenue grounds and simplicity grounds. In terms of a broad revenue raiser, I would like to see a value-added tax, which partially funds a universal basic income. I wrote a paper on that for Wendy, or for Jay, I guess, a couple years ago, for Hamilton. And then we need to do, if we're going to put in a broad-based tax like that, we need, I think, to raise taxes on the wealthy, and that involves either taxing gains at death and or converting the estate tax to an inheritance tax, which has significant revenue potential. There are other things, but our time is limited. I'm sorry.
Please.
I do want to add one more thing. Given the difficulties in cutting spending, the notion that 3/4 of spending is those 4 big things, and no one came up with really great ideas on how to cut healthcare spending. Given that, it's going to be difficult to do a whole lot on the spending side, I think. So I think a fair chunk of our fiscal consolidation is going to have to come on the tax side. Sorry to interrupt.
No. I think that's a world I'd be pretty happy to live in. I'm a little, Bill would have to convince me that the carbon tax and the value-added tax can coexist. But Bill can convince me of that.
I wasn't sure if that was a both or an either
Yeah.
or.
I'm
would
gonna
layer
not
those
let
on
the
top of each
perfect
other?
Be the enemy of the good.
That's right. I think so. I won't repeat any of that stuff. I think I didn't think in 2016 that individual tax rates were terribly high, and I thought our economy could withstand those tax rates. So I don't as long as Bill has passed me the magic wand, and I don't have to worry about politics. I think we should let all of the lower tax rates in the 2017 Tax Act, facing individuals, I think we should let those expire. And I think that we should raise more money from corporations. Raising the corporate tax rate would be a good start, not back to where it was pre-2017 Tax Act, but raise it. I totally appreciate all of the economic modeling done by many of the people in this room, showing the negative incentive effects from that, but I also appreciate that corporations are very clever at making sure that money, that their profits never actually make it into taxable income. So I think it's a second best over first best kind of issue. And I think we should get smarter people than me to figure out ways of improving the international tax system and do more to become consistent with Pillar 2, just to make sure that we don't have U.S. multinationals actually paying taxes to other countries.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
So you said to let the rates expire from the TCJA,
Yep.
but to keep all the things that narrow the tax base, like the doubling of the standard deduction,
Oh,
the
no, no, no,
doubling
no,
of
no,
the
no,
child.
I
Do
like,
you
I
keep
like the
those or
higher,
let those
I like
go?
I very much like the higher standard deduction.
What about the offsets? You have the SALT cap and mortgage interest and
So I think raising the standard deduction does most of the work. So I'm less worried about mortgages. I'm perfectly happy to get rid of the SALT. I mean, the SALT stuff.
course.
I'm on the side of justness and goodness and light. What were the other questions? Okay.
I think that answered.
So I think that's it. So I'll say a couple of things. So I agree with, strongly agree with Bill's first two suggestions, or there's sort of three maybe. So we need to fund the tax collectors so they can collect the taxes that are due and that are properly owed, for sure. I don't know exactly what that level is, but somebody should figure it out. We should give them the money, the resources that they need. I totally agree with taking out the subsidies for clean energy and green energy and replacing it with a price on carbon. These issues are large. I mean, that's a lot of money right there. Probably won't solve our problems, but those two issues alone, I think, are like trillion-dollar issues.
Isn't a carbon tax, though, if it works correctly, designed to eventually raise zero?
Only if you think that the optimal level of emissions is zero. I mean, depends on what the emissions are. So you could, but there's a question about what the long.
But I mean, if it incentivizes what people are trying to incentivize with a carbon tax, then it's sort of like tobacco taxes, right? It's going to decline as a revenue source over time.
It may, depending on the rate and depending on the responsiveness.
That's when Bill's VAT gets bigger.
That's when the VAT, yeah. I would also say that I don't see. This is a point I think I was trying to allude to earlier, which is like this issue around changing the progressivity of the tax code as the way to, or the time to raise more revenues, which is certainly, I mean, we can do that. I mean, we could sort of kill two birds with one stone if those are both if you have both of those objectives. I think it makes the problem more difficult, though, just as a political matter. And I think there's pressures on both sides, right? I mean, so some people might argue like, oh, this is the moment to increase the progressivity of the tax code, and then people might make the opposite argument. They might say, well, the argument that I was making, sort of like, oh, well, if we want to have more revenues, we need to have a system that's flatter. That's going to be more efficient. So let's push the progressivity the other way. Or you can kind of come into the middle and you might say, let's try to hold the progressivity of the tax code relatively constant. And think about how we could raise revenues. And so there are ways that we could raise revenues while holding the progressivity of the tax code relatively constant. And that would be, recognizing the fact that lots of taxpayers have income that's not taxed. Their health insurance benefits are not taxed; they're excluded. And so by for example, bringing in employer-provided health insurance into the tax code, we would raise, depending on how you structure it, tons of money. And for each taxpayer, they would pay at their marginal rate, and so that it would be consistent with the progressivity of the tax code. It's not perfectly true because not everyone has employer-provided health insurance, of course. But those types of ideas, we're changing the indexing of the tax code, not to make it more perfect, but to generate more revenue, would be something that would hold constant the progressivity of the tax code. And so I would think about trying to find ways to raise revenues by broadening the base in a broad way, as sort of my first best, in addition to the other policies that we discussed.
And to Bill's point that we're going to have to do this mostly on taxes, it's going to be hard to do it on spending. That kind of gets into the issue of there's actually a lot of sort of spending through the tax code, and I'm not putting this as a question because I want to see if we have any audience questions. I'm just kind of putting it out there that there are ways to actually reduce the extent to which government distorts the economy that raise revenue rather than cutting spending. And with that, I will stop asking questions and see if we have audience questions. Oh, am I calling on people?
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to go to Pete here.
I'm afraid a lot of the history of the proposal to tax capital gains at death has been lost. I was in a closed-door meeting in the Ways and Means Committee in '76 when Al Ullman thought he had the votes to have a capital gains tax at death. And the number 2 Democrat, Sam Gibbons from Florida, said, no, wait a minute, you're going to force all the family farms to be sold. Well, there's a lot fewer family farms now, and most of the agriculture is big corporate farms. And the SCF, Survey of Consumer Finance from the Fed, is showing a tripling of wealth since 2010. So isn't that an argument for a capital gains at death?
Yeah. If you did it in the current system, you'd probably want to make some adjustment to the state tax so you're not doubling the tax. But something like, there's the composition of estates in the top 1% or over 10 million. A very substantial share of those estates consist of unrealized capital gains. I'm not sure if it's 40 or 50%, but it's something like that in that group. And that income is never taxed under the income tax, right? Because it's given it basis step up. So you could do carryover basis instead, but that means it may not be taxed for hundreds of years, you know? And so I feel, well, right, that's true too. But I feel like you know, people argue for a wealth tax, you know, an annual wealth tax. That's pretty hard to do, just administratively. But there is a reckoning that happens at death with estates, and there's no reason to give that the angel of death loophole that.
It just doesn't score as well because it's so far in the future.
Carryover basis, yeah.
Or no, just even anything about estate taxes, because it's
Yeah.
you know, you don't get
But
politicians can't spend the
taxing
money
gains
right
at
now.
death, I mean, the issues with farms and businesses, A, are not that big, and B, can be dealt with.
Yeah.
But in particular, it reduces the lock-in effect during life because people are holding on to assets because they know they can pass tax-free at death. So I think it has a lot to offer. One side issue is that gifts are treated on a carryover basis. I'm not sure you want to get into this, George, but there are side issues to deal with.
There was a question in the back. Is my mic on or did it go off?
I just have a quick question, hopefully, and I'm hoping that the panel might be able to discuss it a little bit. As a part of reform, can we agree to be more truthful to the American people about what the actual deficits of our country is? In 2022, we reported a $1.4 trillion budget deficit when the actual bottom line loss to the country was $4.2 trillion. Last year, we reported a $1.7 trillion budget deficit when the actual was $3.4 trillion. And if anybody doubts my numbers, just look at the annual financial statements for our country, and you'll see it in there. Now, that's on the accrual basis of accounting, and that's defined as the actual bottom line of the country. So when will Washington start telling people what the real loss is versus what the cash basis loss is, when the cash basis number, in my view, is used primarily to figure out what our debt financing needs to be? Also, when you're looking at that financial statement, take a look at the balance sheet. There's $17 trillion worth of liabilities built up on that balance sheet that are not part of the $26 or $27 trillion of debt outstanding that we will have to incur debt for. So anybody want to feel that or give me your thoughts on it?
Would have been a perfect question for Kent.
Yeah, he's in the front row. You can catch him afterwards.
I'll jump into the breach and just say one thing, which is I think that these calculations that, and this partly goes to the excellent conversation that Alan and Kent had earlier. I think when we think about implicit liabilities and add up all of the liabilities on that part of the balance sheet, I think one has to be careful to also add up to. I can't remember if it was Alan or Kent is talking about what you actually want to. You need a useful denominator, And you can either make that denominator like a net present value of GDP. You can, even more narrowly make it a net present value of all revenues under current law. But I think if you're going to do one of these things where like, oh, on the left-hand side of my balance sheet, in the red, I have this really big, scary number. I think if you want to make that have economic meaning, then you got to talk about what's on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, which is a whole lot of output, or taxable income, or potentially taxable income, right, which is basically GNP.
Yeah. Can you solve that problem by showing the net? The liabilities.
Well,
net
and then you get to like fiscal gap calculations,
right,
basically.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Kent was showing a net number,
Yep.
net of a payroll tax. But I'll just add on this point. I mean, there is like a really hard problem on communicating these issues. I think I'm pretty sure that I don't know what $67 trillion means.
Yep.
So if you tell me something $67 trillion, like I just kind of shut down and I
Yep.
don't really worry about it because it's
What
so
if
big.
I tell you, if I stacked that up to the moon, and like, does that help?
That's right. Yeah,
I don't
that
know.
one
I don't know how far the moon is either. So
yeah.
no, and Alex makes a really important point, right? With the average American, you start talking about trillions, whether it's 1 trillion or 100 trillion, it becomes a meaningless number at that point. I think that more broadly is one of the biggest challenge we face is how to communicate these problems in ways that are salient to average people.
Slightly more substantively, the other thing I'll say, from my time at CBO, I'm surrounded by my old CBO colleagues, which makes me very happy. From my time at CBO, I mean, as we thought a lot about how to effectively communicate these issues to policymakers, and you show a projection under current law where under current law debt to GDP after 30 years is going to be, I can't even remember what it's supposed to be, 150%, 170%. And then you say, oh, but I know what'll get them to act. Let's do debt to GDP under current policy. Oh, I know what'll get. What if it's current policy and we put in an alternative scenario for interest rates that are even higher? Like at a certain point, that if debt as a share of GDP rising 50 percentage points over time wasn't going to get their attention, like 70 percentage points, that's what's going to get their attention? Oh, 80 percentage points? Like it's, I at least my personal experience was that ever scarier projections were not going to do the thing that broke through all of the political hurdles where we started.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe, if there is one. Back here.
Yeah, it's been a great day, great panel. Let me ask Bill Gale. I find it interesting that you're going to other kinds of taxes, not relying on the income tax for your ideal world. That tax, I believe that is considered a consumption tax. Everything I hear or been taught is that's really the best way to go. However, would you pair that with the retaining the current income tax? And also, just from all of your experience and personal judgment, I am curious, what do you think is the highest level that should be appropriate for a high earner marginal income tax? As you know, it's already at 55% in high income states for income over $1 million, approximately.
Thank you for the question. I do think we should retain the income tax. I think we could push the top rate up above the high 30s and the federal statutory rate. I'm aware that there's a combination with state tax and phase outs and stuff like that. I don't think I'm not talking about 70% or something like that, but I think there's room there, but I didn't put that as a top priority because I feel like it's too much of the debate in DC, and this applies not just this year, but especially to next year. Too much the debate is going to be focused on TCJA And do we extend this? Do we extend that? Do we cut back? And not enough is focused on, there are all these other ideas, all these ideas that Milton Friedman said were, on the shelf, and that personally we all take personal pride in putting on the shelf. And I would like to see the debate be much more expansive than just, do we extend 25%, 50%, or 100% of TCJA.
Okay. Thank you all. I think problem solved, right?